Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad to have you here with us this afternoon to celebrate Black History Month here at Pitt Community College in this joint venture with our friends and neighbors right down the street at East Carolina University. The name or the theme of today's program is Black to the Future, Tracking Folk and Family Ways from Africa to the Americas. And this presentation today is offered to you from PCC Global and the ECU Ethnic Studies Program. So I'd like to first welcome everyone, and I would like to introduce our speakers for today. So I'll tell you a little bit about them. First and foremost, Mr. Jared Miles is a senior training instructor in the ECU English department, where he has been teaching for over 15 years. He is the co-director of the Ethnic Studies minor at the university, the former chair of the Student Scholarships, Fellowships, and Financial Aid Committee for the English department, and the head of the Multicultural Reading Day Committee for the Multicultural and Transnational Literature Committee, of which he's also a member. Additionally, he is the English department computer technician and media specialist. He's also the co-founder of Gameplay, Police, Life, and Youth, a labor of love involving community, family, and the lives of young people focused on fostering meaningful and good relations with the police in Greenville, North Carolina through gaming. In his spare time, he enjoys spending time with his wife and children, watching Japanese movies of all types, and practicing the martial arts. Welcome, Mr. Miles.
It's nice to be here. I'm ready to talk about some Black to the future. To speculate.
And let me also introduce our second presenter, Ms. Regina Garcia. She has been an instructor of English and Developmental Studies since 1999 at PCC. She serves as the Global Programs Coordinator, the Scholars of Global Distinction Co-Coordinator, and the Multicultural Activities Committee Chairperson. She is a writer, speaker, podcaster, spoken word performer, and Emmy Award-winning narrator. She is a wife and the mother of 3 talented sons, a new mother-in-law, and a community leader in several local, regional, and national organizations, including the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Historic Bath Commission, the Greenville Pitt County Area Section of the National Council of Negro Women, and her illustrious sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, to which our current Vice President, Kamala Harris, also belongs. She is a UNC Tar Heel with a BA in Speech Communication from Chapel Hill, and also an ECU Pirate, where she received a master's in education and a graduate certificate in multicultural and transnational literature. Some of her favorite hobbies are cooking, singing, and genealogy. Thank you both. I'll turn this over now to Mr. Miles.
All right. I think we're going to start with Regina first.
Forgive me. Right. We will start with Ms. Garcia first.
Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I'm just really excited to be here with you today to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and that's the Black family. So I have the first part, and Professor Miles will have the second part, and I'm going to carry you. We're going to float the boat right up until the civil rights movement, and so let's get ready to go. From West Africa, they sought them, caught, captured, and sold them, stuffed them in holes, and then beneath large, unclean barges, over 12.5 million people, human beings, pushed through rough ocean, huddled and stacked or bound and shackled in chains, no notions that they would remain moaning refrains of mercy while tossed on an angry sea. Yet another phase that marked the beginning of days that did not promise any earthly end, stripped from societies formed around extended family units, stripped from over 500 languages, stripped from familiar scenery, stripped from the taste that graced tongues and bellies, stripped from circles of praise and dance, stripped from righteous rites of passage, distinct and diverse systems of belief, ancestrally grounded, yet now writhing in grief, just stripped down to be torn and reborn into hell. From vile hovels and unclean wells of despair, those who had not leapt into the sea lifted up hooded eyes when no one was watching and reactivated the strength that had been buried on board deep within, sent to replace others the strangers attempted to annihilate and erase. Good afternoon. When we shift our eyes and minds to this transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans, we, in our genteel thought, find it hard to conceive that such an undertaking of evil could have ever taken place on such a scale as this. The literal displacement and mental, emotional, and cultural disfigurement of this group of people is mind-boggling to people who were not immersed in it. And I was not immersed in it. And you were not immersed in it. And yet the drama and trauma of it all has placed an indelible mark on our society, and especially on our families. To have any real understanding, though, of what it means to be stripped of personal mobility and behavioral autonomy is beyond for those of us who have not been trafficked and confined. And that is one of the reasons I always stand in amazement to hear people say things like, there were some good masters, though. Some live better than they did over there in Africa. And the ever ignorant, at least they found Jesus when they got here. So I want to talk a little bit about what they did find when they got here, as they were detained here, and even as they stayed here to take part in the freedom. Further, we want to consider that these facts, concepts, and ideas and experiences, how they impacted the Black family. So a warning, and Dr. Rook kind of gave you this warning a little bit earlier. I'm an avid personal family genealogist. So some of what I will share with you today will be directly linked to some of what happened in regards to my own ancestors. And some is connected to just the realities that are important to understand. Certainly almost every family that I know, Black and otherwise, has a boatload of differences related to a diversity of factors that are sometimes intangible to conceive. And these factors include family makeup and philosophy, religion, socioeconomic status, child rearing practices, interactions, behaviors, and values. And so then that just leads me to say, well, what is a Black family? And how can it even be discussed as a collective? The Black family. It's a term that I really struggled with, for when I look at even my own family, when I look at all the lines that conversion make little on me and my own husband and my own babies, not all of those lines were even what one would consider to be Black. Yet here I sit, Black as ever and proud to be so. I'm Black yet brown, Black yet whole, Black yet educated, Black yet bold, Black yet connected to a rainbow of friends. Black, very Black, trying to love without end. But despite all of these realities and diversities and even hesitations towards establishing an overarching identification, the Black family is certainly still here and a whole wonder to behold. Now, as I said in my opening, approximately 12.5 million Africans were caught and bought, chained and shamed and steered towards the Americas. And they came from a diversity of regions, languages, and faith systems. They had different ways of living and being. So we must look at the fact that in the past, prior to the arrival on the shores of the Americas, the Black family is not monolithic. they're not all the same, and they have always possessed a variety of constructs and ways of living and being. Some realities that are generally true are that by and large, the West African family structures identified primarily within their extended family or clan, and society actually formed around them rather than like an ethnic or national identity. Wives, children, and dependents were a sign of wealth. Men frequently practiced polygamy or the custom of having more than one wife. In times of need, West Africans often relied on relatives from near and far for support. Family formed the core of the support and was indeed, in a way, society itself. And additionally, faith systems played a crucial role in interactions, values, beliefs, and behavior. African religious practices were diverse, and additionally, many African families practiced the Islamic faith. And at this point, I just want to just stop and tell you that in your YouTube link, your YouTube chat room, I put 2 links to a program that has recently been aired on PBS called The Black Church. There's so much insight regarding the role of the Black church and even what Africans, the West Africans, brought themselves to this land that we can see in those church traditions. So I do highly recommend that. So over the period of the Atlantic slave trade from approximately 1526 to 1867, some 12.5 million slaves were shipped from Africa and 10.7 million arrived in the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade was likely the most costly in human life of all long distance global migrations. The first Africans forced to work in the New World left from Europe, though, at the beginning of the 16th century and not from Africa. And the first slave voyage direct from Africa to the Americas probably sailed in about 1526. However, I want you to note that the grand majority of these victims of human trafficking were not brought to the United States. And I know how we think about it. Often when we think about the trade, we think about Africans just being brought here, but actually we were not like the largest holder of enslaved people. I often think of how people tend to view the term Black in regards to those of African descent as people of people from Africa and here. But of course, the diaspora went everywhere. In 1619, right up the road on the shores of Jamestown, Virginia, Black African people stepped off the boat and were brought in as servants. However, less than a decade after 1619, the first enslaved Africans were brought to New Amsterdam, now known as New York. So they were brought here. Just be clear. Didn't purchase a ticket, weren't taking a planned family trip. Most often, the whole family didn't even make it here. And even when they did, they most often didn't stay together. So right off the jump, the Black family in the United States and in other lands along the route had to deal with the horrendous trauma of being separated from the familiar and forced into unknown lands with unknown people. And they were bought, sold, placed, and forced into a way of life that they had previously not known. By 1690, every colony on these lands in what we now know as the United States had trafficked Africans living within their borders. Black family. So what does this mean? While in earlier times, the term indentured may have been used, indicating that after a while, after a period of indenture, one might be able to work and accumulate enough to pay a debt or satisfy a contract and thus be released from all of that. However, the institution of slavery changed the game, and even some who were previously identified as indentured servants suddenly found themselves unable to look toward freedom. What did enslavement mean for them? It meant being completely vulnerable to the will of those who were not enslaved and caught up on the bottom rung of the hierarchy in which enslaved Africans and their enslaved descendants found themselves. Now, this is not to say that all Black people were enslaved or stayed enslaved. There were some who were never enslaved, some who were what we call manumitted or freed, as in the case of my Carter line in my own family, who had the fortune of, between 1791 and 1797, being freed by their enslaver, Robert Carter. He freed 450 enslaved persons. Look him up, Robert Carter III, because it conflicted with his ever-strengthening Christian values. He could only begin to contemplate doing this, however, until a manumission law was passed in 1782, following the principles of liberty that were asserted in the waging of the Revolutionary War to allow people who own people to free people. So recognize that before this, if you own people, you couldn't free them. This law allowed him to do it. So 2 points here. All of the African diaspora was not enslaved. Many of the African diaspora were enslaved, and it did make a difference. So how does it, make that difference? What does that mean for the Black family? So if a person of African descent were freed through manumission or born to free mothers, or a Black person came free to this land under someone else's protection, then that did not necessarily mean that they escaped the peril associated with the nature of skin color or station or ethnicity. It meant you were counted, important, and you could own land, and you could raise your own family many times. However, legislation cannot always, as I often say, govern the hearts of men. For what might have been legal, what rights free people of this country should have been allowed to practice was not always practiced. Whether the freedoms were withheld due to de facto laws or through ordinances that challenged the ability of an individual to live and operate and voice freely. However, from about the middle of the 1700s to this very day, the lives of my father populated an area of what is now called Craven and Carteret counties, and most of those people lived free, owned land, raised family, and some even fought in the Revolutionary War. This, however, does not mean they live without strife. Be clear on that. That created some family traumas. For while many were born into freedom, there were some that were stolen and sold down the river. That happened. And additionally, many had lands confiscated by nearby white landowners who tricked them out of land through the use of forged signatures, and many had to pay off officials to keep their peace and their fortune. So a Black family's freedom, particularly in the South, was fraught with threat. Threat in regards to loss of property, and certainly in regards to the loss of life. As it related to enslaved Africans, however, this was amplified greatly. The threat to the Black individual was ever present, which made the threat to the family structure almost never secure. So as we consider the life of the enslaved, we find that their lives were not their own, and their ability to count on biological relations being around them was even less likely. And terrifyingly, Black women and men too were subject to experiencing sexual exploitations over and over. And indeed, many plantations actually prided themselves on being breeding farms. Additionally, being sold down the river, which actually meant like being sold towards Louisiana, which was a place where supposedly plantations were far more brutal than some of the ones that were, up further north. It was a terrible reality, and one not even missed in my own family. When at every family reunion on my maternal Adams line, we heard the story told with interesting calm and even mild humor of how old man Whitehurst kept the pretty women close to the house and how all my forebears' children were his. There's the additional story of how one of the children was sold down the river to Louisiana. And so it is told she got word back to her family after the war, telling them she was coming home. Last they heard, she was in Georgia when the communication stopped, and she never arrived, and she was never found. However, to this very day, her name continues to be called and her story continues to be told. Black family. So emancipation, then that happened. Unless you were in Texas, it was a whole nother story. Juneteenth, look that up. Post-war for many, especially those who had not escaped North, was initially hopeful for some 1866 to 1877 marked Reconstruction. And so during this time, some of the things that families were prevented from doing during that period of enslavement, they could do. So they could marry. So any partnerships that happened that were allowed on plantations and farms and places where people were held in bondage, they could make those legal. So marriage was legalized, and many who were enslaved sought to find one another, and family and kinship ties and ties formed, and ties within the Black churches formed and began to solidify and create a sense of permanence within families. I can count three individuals within my family that started churches right after emancipation. And so in my own experiences, in my family, there are churches that are filled with our ancestors. And I know some of the people here today have that experience as well. However, as it had been for centuries now in the United States, family life for Black Americans could not rely on the same protections as others granted with the new status of citizenship. At the same time Reconstruction began in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan formed in Tennessee. And so we have this string of events that begins to occur. 1868, the 14th Amendment is ratified, and it defines citizenship, and it overturns the Dred Scott decision. And then 1870, the 15th Amendment is ratified, giving African Americans the right to vote. In 1877, the era of Reconstruction ends. However, a deal is made with the Southern Democratic leaders and Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, and it puts an end to the efforts to protect the civil rights of African Americans. So many of those gains that had been made were kind of snatched away at that time. I mean, there were people in legislature, Black people in positions, and all of that started to end in the South. 1879, thousands of African Americans began to migrate out of the South to escape oppression. And then in 1881, we have the first Jim Crow segregation law, segregating railroads. And then over the next 15 years or so, similar laws were passed in the Southern states. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, racial segregation is ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court. And then the Jim Crow separate but equal laws begin, barring African Americans from equal access to public facilities. So we have now a barrage of blows to pummel and thwart equality brought by the peace of Black families, particularly in the South. It brought it to its knees. While amendments have been made to ensure the rights for those recently freed citizens, Jim Crow crushed the dreams and prevented these descendants of Africa from regularly experiencing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as did many of their counterparts. What impact does this have on the Black family? The impact is to the ability to have equal access in regards to employment, protections under the law, adequate health care, voting, education, and all of these things directly impact certainly socioeconomic status and the opportunities for upward mobility that many of their white counterparts could engage in. And while we may point to accounts and stories of happy times, periods of artistic flourishing, oasis of positive race relations, accounts of whites and blacks crossing color lines to help one another. There's also the truth of the Black migrations from the South to the North, separating families in attempts to achieve a modicum of prosperity. Attacks on Black citizens for simply living while Black. Times when accusations could end a Black person's life. Lynchings were a reality during this time. As the story goes, my paternal grandfather, Leander Carter Sr., was accused of the age-old whistling at a white woman. So the story goes, he was chopped up and buried in a field, and his body was never recovered. Jobs such as sharecropping that were often undertaken by entire families that sometimes proved to be one step outside of enslavement, as somehow all the money that had been earned had to be returned to settle farm credit debt for food, thus perpetuating the continuing oppressive ties to families that still viewed them as their property. The takeaway regarding the Black family from 1597 to the Civil Rights Movement is one that reveals that it was more vulnerable to flux than many others in this land. However, it also reveals that its ability to adapt and persist, even in the midst of that madness, is amazing. Resiliently, brilliantly amazing, full of a great propensity to create and extend family and have culture spring out around it. For the Black family in America, even from the arrival on the shores of this country, was able to set up a camp for survival that showed that despite the brutal stripping that they were undergoing, they would live on. Oh, and they did this in many ways by analyzing the framework and pouring the God that they knew into the structure of their oppressors. And God manifested for them, for did not the Hebrew children walk through the barren land and come out on the other side? Connecting and identifying like spirits and inviting them into their lives. Fictive kin. You become my mother, my father, my grandfather, my grandmother, brother, sister, cousin, auntie, until I have to go, taking your words and your stories with me on how to live, how to love, and how to be. Honoring family gone and their ancestors from mother's land, that they might be seen again, preparing bodies for landing. They done a good job with the body. Look like they sleep. Elevating innards to gristle, to guts, to glorious heights that we, the family, might live to fight another day. Picking up babies left and adding them to their own. Building schools, businesses, making sacrifices for the next one. Teaching, preaching, dreaming, dreaming, dreaming. Black families. Oh, what a wonder. The boat stops right here, the Civil War. And so next, I would like to present to you Professor Jeremiah from East Carolina University.
I love the fact that you stopped on dreaming, because that's what I'm going into right now. I mean, that's what I want to get to in my section. But did you ever want me to show that picture for you?
Did it? Oh, it did. Ever got show? Well, show the picture.
This is Regina's part.
This is my picture.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. And so what you see in this picture are just kind of representations of the Black family throughout their journey and as they came into America and you know, it went through the different phases. And so we have the ship and we have the auction block and families being torn apart. And then we have a family in Reconstruction. If you look down at that lower, I guess that would be my left, your right corner, you'll see a family and there's a man there that looks like he has on a uniform And then, of course, you see the Jim Crow picture, the family that's standing behind their by their cars with all of their furniture and clothing on it. And it's really interesting. Um, it reminds me, you've heard of the Green Book, and how Black families had to be careful about where they went when they traveled. And so the Green Book was created to identify places where they could find lodging and food and things like that. And it was brought back to my remembrance again as I watched Lovecraft Country, which I'm not going to start talking about because if I start talking about Lovecraft Country, I'll keep talking. And
yeah, we love that. We love some Lovecraft Country.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So are there any questions before we move on to my section? I mean, are there any people in the Mr. Professor White inside the chat that have any questions?
Not yet.
All right. That's fine. Okay. So I'm glad that Regina stopped with the dreaming aspect, because that's what we often do in science fiction. All right. And a lot of what I'm talking about today has to do with science fiction and Afrofuturism and looking at what the Black family will be in the future and beyond. All right. But before we get there, we, just like Regina, we have to look at some of the science fiction tropes. I mean, these are actually tropes that you'll see in science fiction now, but back in the past, these were actual realities. These are the things that kept the Black family. Many of these things definitely affected the family and how the family was put together, and the whether or not the family would actually exist inside of America. Some of these tropes that we call them now were actual realities for the people that had to go through them. So that's why I call this particular slide "Death by Science Fiction," because these things are supposed to be science fiction. And what science fiction does is that it presents you with the possibilities, right? It presents you with the what ifs. Like, what if this happened and what would occur afterwards? And with that what if, you can predict a change that you want to occur, or you can predict a warning, give people a warning about what you don't want to occur, all right? And also it's just good for intelligent and intellectual reflection, right? But these things were reality. And one of those realities in terms of these particular ideas was the extinction thesis, all right? Now, you wouldn't believe that now, since Blacks are seen to be like superior in many sports. I mean, sometimes the stereotypes change, right? Right now, Blacks are usually considered like, if you don't have any Black people on your basketball team, how are you going to win? Or something like that. That's the idea, right? That people hold that stereotype in mind. But back then in 1896, this man called Frederick Hoffman, who was a Prudential life insurance statistician, wrote this particular very interesting not controversial, but is very influential towards maintaining and starting segregation in the United States, was Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. This was published in 1896. And in it, he wrote many other things, but the whole idea was that the Black person, the Negro, was being pretty much selected out of existence. And in Vital Capacity, he wrote, the tendency of the Negro race has always been downward. This tendency must lead to a still greater mortality, and in the end cause the extinction of the race. And basically, we're using a little bit of selected idea that we are being selected out of existence, that somehow we cannot make it. Now, of course, he did not consider that many of the people that he considered weak were actually impoverished, were marginalized, were segregated, were victims of Jim Crow and other forms of social terrorism, and also did not have medical treatment. All right. So of course, saying that these people are weak and they're going to be killed, die because they're being selected out of natural existence is probably not the smartest thing to say. But if you believed in this particular stereotype, you believe this to be a reality. Yeah, I can see how he got there. Mostly based on his own concepts of what Black people can and cannot do, though. So the extinction thesis. And like I said, stereotypes change. We have a now stereotype where nobody would consider this to be true, but now that we have Black athletes that are seemingly superior, but then we also have things against Black people like their moral degradation or their mental degradation. All right. Also, the American eugenics movement. All right. One of the things you have to take, the reality of this is that this happened all across America, but specifically, we have it very close to home here in North Carolina. There was a North Carolina eugenics board, all right? Inside that eugenics board, from that span of from like I think it started in 1919, but from 1929 in terms of the numbers that we have. And you also see a chart down there of all the particular eugenics sterilizations that happen in North Carolina, and 141 happening in Pitt County itself. But from 1929 to 1974, there was this eugenics council. Now, what is eugenics? This is a scientific trope. You know, you might have heard about it in science fiction. You might have seen it in the Star Trek movie, right? Khan Noonien Sung was a eugenics experiment and stuff like this, who started a master race and tried to take over the world in Star Trek. Okay, so you've seen this probably in science fiction movies or books or novels or novelettes before, right? But the whole thing is that in America, they truly believed that they were trying to make a better race of people. In fact, a lot of the ideas that the Nazis got or Hitler got about eugenics and about purity of blood, some of it came from American scientists, the American concepts of eugenics. All right. So in this eugenics movement, it was all about purity of blood, or one aspect of it. That's one aspect of American society, is about keeping the gold standard and keeping it pure. All right. And excising those who don't meet that particular standard. But inside this eugenics movement, also, they were trying to better humanity. The whole idea is that we don't want people who are insane. We don't want people who are mentally deficient or physically deficient. We're trying to create a better American in this particular way. And in doing so, in that idea, they sterilized almost 8,000 people from 1929 to 1974. And think about that. 1974 was when it became, when it was shut down. So that's a long time. That's recent history. 1974 doesn't seem that recent, but some of these people are still alive, in that suffered through the sterilization process. Okay. But the reason why I brought that up in terms of the Black family is that, first, you can't have a Black, in terms of the extinction thesis, if we're dead, we can't have a Black family. We're dying out. All right. And in terms of American eugenics, toward the end of it, toward like the mid-end of the eugenics movement, there was a disproportionate amount of Black women who were being sterilized. Basically, a genocidal aspect of trying to, in some ways, destroy the family as we know it, or Blacks as we know it in terms, because we're already a small part of the population in itself. All right. Now, eugenics wasn't just for Blacks, though. It was also for white people and everybody else in America who didn't meet a certain testing level and things like this. But toward the end there, or toward the mid-end, there was a disproportionate amount of Blacks that suffered from this particular this science trope that you will see now in science fiction. All right. Now, why am I focusing on science fiction? Because it's all about the future, right? In the future, the science is about the technology that projects us into the future, gives us an idea of what the future might be like and what kind of things we can do in the future. All right. Good or bad. Now, I can't really see. Let me see if I can move this over here. Yeah, there we go. I had to move this screen over a little bit. So another interesting thing that I chose to do because talk about it was the Moynihan report and the road to help. As you can see, is it hell? Is it a road to hell or a road to help? Because if you had to look up the word problematic in the dictionary, the Moynihan report should be right there. It should be right there beside the word problematic, because in many ways, this was supposed to be a way to help Black people in America. All right. And I think this man right here, if you can see my cursor right here, I'm on top of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. His heart was in the right place. This is not an evil man. This is not a bad man at all and stuff like this. And his heart was in to help the Negro people and during that particular time. And he was actually tapped by JFK, but JFK died, and then Lyndon B. Johnson took over. And Lyndon B. Johnson wanted this report. He wanted this report, the Negro Family, the Case for National Action. And he was going to use that as a platform to help Black people, to further the civil rights movement. But the negative aspects, the report itself is infamous because It's an investigation of inner city poverty, as it says here, which trace the problems in African-American life to the breakdown of families. All right. So the problems in African-American life, what we go through in America is the reason for the breakdown of the Black family in America. All right. That's not so, I mean, that's not an impossible thing to imagine, especially if you're an impoverished person living in a ghetto or something like that. That's not an impossible thing to imagine. Even Ta-Nehisi Coates here, who's a famous writer, and I guess he's a philosopher too, I suppose. But he defends the report. This report was from 1965, and most people don't defend this report. But you got to say that the last point where you had a federal official making an argument, an implicit argument for massive benevolent investment in African-American communities and tying that case for investment to history. That is something that just would not happen today. All right. So is it the road to hell or the road to help? Let's see. All right. So as you see with my Obama here, doesn't sound so bad. Let's read some of these things that were said in the report. That the Negro American has survived at all is extraordinary. A lesser people might simply have died out, as indeed others have. That the Negro community has not only survived, but in this political generation has entered national affairs as a moderate, humane, and constructive national force is the highest testament to the healing powers of the democratic ideal and the creative vitality of the Negro people. That does not sound like a thoughtless man. That does not sound like a man who is not mindful. All right. Another one, there's absolutely no question of any genetic differential. Intelligence potential is distributed among Negro infants in the same proportion as among Icelanders or Chinese or any other group. American society, however, impairs the Negro potential. Okay, again, something that you probably, you wouldn't think that this infamous report would actually have things like this in it. And the final words of the report, at the very end of the report, is stated that the policy of the United States is to bring the Negro American to full and equal sharing in the responsibilities and rewards of citizenship. To this end, the programs of the federal government bearing on this objective shall be designed to have the effect, directly or indirectly, of enhancing the stability and resources of the Negro American family. And all I can say is, yay, this sounds great. This sounds really good. So let's go to the next slide and see how it's so bad. It's not that good. All right. So one of the things, why this is problematic, some of it has to do with Daniel Patrick Moynihan's language. Okay. One of the things he says is the Negro family is a tangle of pathologies. All right. So a pathology usually is like, you study diseases, so the Negro family is a tangle of things that are tearing it down from the inside, diseases, so to speak. And remember, this is 1965. So some of these diseases are Negro community has been forced into a matriarchal structure. Now, right off the bat, you can see feminists will say, what? Either old or modern feminists will say, what? Why is a matriarchal structure a bad thing, so to speak, And this has been a common thing in the Black community since slavery times in terms of the matriarchal structure in some ways, especially with the women having to take on roles where the men are absent or vacant, and not because it's not always their fault, because as we know, sometimes there's a pipeline to jail and stuff like this that is like overburdened with African-American males and sort of targets them in many ways. All right. But apparently at this particular time, since most of the world was patriarchal, this is having a matriarchal structure with inside your family was a bad thing to many people. All right. Negro illegitimacy rate. All right. The lack of father in the house, not knowing one's father leads to delinquency, Black on Black crime, lack of role models, Black unemployment, unable to support family structure. Now, he also states unequivocally that this is not about the Black middle class, that he's talking about the impoverished, uneducated Black lower classes. But many people, and I think this is a person who is, like I said, I think Moynihan's issue is his language sometimes, and sometimes his contradictions in terms of what he says one way and what he says another way. But if you look at the time period in which you're at the height of the civil rights movement in 1965, you got the Vietnam War going on, you got the feminist movement going on. There's a lot of heightened awareness of certain things. Black power is about to start up and stuff like this. And people, when they heard this, and then this was supposed to be a private report, they rejected it completely, and they basically said, you're blaming the victim, so to speak. You're blaming the victim for all of these particular things, because these are things that happen because society has done this to us, American society specifically. This comes from slavery. This comes from social terrorism. This comes from many other things that have happened in society that affects Black people still. All right, but you're blaming the victim for these. I don't think he was blaming the victim, so to speak, but that's how it was taken, and that's why this report is considered infamous. Some of these things are insulting, but some of these things you have to consider also, and that's why it's problematic, in many ways. Now, in opposed to that particular, the Moynihan report, many people, especially during the late 70s and stuff like that, came up with the strength theory. Because the idea is that all the things that we learned in slavery, all the things that we learned how to survive as a family or an extended family, or to have a matriarchal structure, all those things that actually worked to keep us strong as a Black family, those particular things were looked at as weaknesses, but now people started to look at them as strengths. And this is and I want you to look at these particular characteristics now, and also, these are like only one of these Black families is real. You probably realize that by now. There's one real Black family. Which one is it? But still, they're representatives and perceptions of what Black people are in media, right? All right. But outside of the one real one that's here. But the strength theory, the following characteristics have been functional for the Black family survival, development, and stability. Strong kinship bonds, strong work orientation, adaptability of family roles, strong achievement orientation, strong religious orientation. And that one is all of them, actually, you have to consider what this means for the future. Like, how would these things change, morph, disappear, or be reinforced, like maybe several hundred years into the future? Because I want to be a little bit speculative, because speculation helps you in many ways, right? Like I said before, if you can speculate on something, you can imagine something way into the future. You can predict maybe something that you don't want to happen or something that you want to happen, and then try to go to that particular goal. All right, that's what science fiction does for us. Gives us the what ifs, the speculation that we can to try to create our own futures. So, of course, if I'm talking about the future, I would have to bring up Afrofuturism. All right, particularly when we talk about Afrofuturism, the idea of Afrofuturism as a concept is talking about, like, the idea starts at the fact that Black people will be in the future. And now this sounds kind of silly right now, but in the 1960s, especially the late 60s, for example, Star Trek here on the far right, Uhura, Nicole Nichols, who played Nicole Nichols, who played Uhura in Star Trek. Her representation as a Black person on a Federation starship that went across the stars, that was something like, oh my God, we're still going to be around. We're not going to be killed. We're not going to be like, we're not going to be bound by social terrorism or by segregation or anything like this. We will actually be in the future, and we will be thriving in that particular future. All right. And she's there to prove it for us. And so in that particular sense, having her on a TV show like Star Trek was very important. And even she tells the story about how Martin Luther King, because she was thinking about leaving the show, but Martin Luther King stopped her from leaving that show. He said, no, we need you there because we need people to see that there is a future for us out there, and that's why I'm trying to get to in terms of Afrofuturism. Is there a future? Sure, there is a future. And what we want in that future is what we speculate about. What is our future representation going to be like? Over here, we're not just existing, we're thriving in the future. We have an assurance and expansion of expression. And that expression could be through music. It could be through technology. It could be through our bodies, our bodies, anything like that. But we still are there in the future. We have complete freedom, whatever that freedom might be. You know, I don't want to get into Lovecraft country, but we can be beyond say. If you ever saw that, if you saw that aspect where the lady was asked, like, why are you still here? She went in that Afrofuturism episode. Why are you still here? You know, you're not in a cage. So how do you let that cage, as George Clinton said in Funkateliki, in Parliament Funkateliki, he said, free your mind and your ass will follow. Exactly. You free yourself. The cage is the cage you put yourself in. Don't let society put you in that cage. Your mind is the cage. You have to free yourself from it in that particular sense. So complete freedom, you know, in that sense. Revisioning the past and also predicting the future. Looking at our past, revisioning it in a different way, but also predicting what kind of future that we'll have for ourselves in the future. So my question is, you know, now that you have the past that Miss Regina Garcia has set up, Professor Garcia has set up, you know, she set up the past. She showed you what the past was like. She showed you what Black families had to go through in the past to survive as a unit. All right. And now I'm asking you to look toward the future. And actually, I'm asking you to look 400 years in the future. What will the Black family look like 400 years into the future? And I want you to use your sci-fi mind, because I want to be a question answer period. I want you to predict, all right, in terms of that sci-fi mind. What would it be like? I want you to warn, perhaps. What if something of this happens? How could it be even worse? You know, so let's make sure that doesn't happen. Or suggest a change of some of type, you know. For example, some ideas I can put in your mind before I let you start thinking about that. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is a concept in science, actually. This is a real scientific idea that in the future, through scientific methods, people will be able to improve themselves intellectually, physically, and psychologically. All right. And that improvement is not like eugenics, because the eugenics was all about excising people from this society, you know, get the people who are wrong in terms of genetically or impure out of society so we can make a better one. But this right here, in terms of transhumanism, the idea in science and science fiction is to somehow to improve humanity. Everybody has the benefits of this approval too, although it might be class-based. You know, if you ever saw Gattaca or Other Science or Brave New World or something like that, it's always something. If it's not race, something comes in mind that can, you know, that causes people to have some sort of issue and not get equal access to to technology. But in transhumanism, you know, we can improve the lifespan, and we're working on that now to improve human lifespan, to improve intellectual capacity, to conclude sensory modalities, you know, for, you know, to make you like feel music and humor and spirituality and aesthetics, look, make you feel more, you know, as a human being. But what I'm also interested in is the body functionality, because as it says here, if you still have a body, you would be able to shape it according to your wishes. All right. So if you have a body that you can shape to your wishes, all right, if you have a body that does not have to be Black, it could be like animal, like you could have a tiger body or something like that, or you could transfer your mind to another body. Also another science fiction trope. If you guys watch Altered Carbon or something like that on Netflix, you might see that people have sleeves, and when they die, they can transfer their minds to another sleeve, another body, and live on pretty much perpetually forever, which is the idea that's a transhumanist idea. All right. So if you have these technologies, how will that affect not just the Black family, but also Black identity? Because we assume that some sort of identity concept is linked to being Black in the Black family. That is not just not the skin color that makes us Black. There might be something else that makes us Black too, in terms of our experiences. With that, with transhumanism could come transracialism. This is Rachel Dolezal. We all know Rachel Dolezal from back in the day, and and you know, she was in charge of the NAACP, I think, in her area. She married a black man. She had black children. She passed herself as black. Actually said in her book, in her or her memoirs, that when she was a child, she felt like she was always black and stuff like this. However, her parents outed her on the picture to the right there as being a white person. All right. And then when people found out that she was actually white, a white person, posing as a black person, the furor that came down on her was like hellfire in that particular sense, from both communities, from white communities and black communities. All right. So my question to you is that, how much is your identity is also important in terms of like how you negotiate with other people within inside your society. But also, if you're transracial, if you're transhuman or transracial, and you can change yourself to be anything you want, how does that affect the black family of the future if people decide to change? Do the dynamics of the black family change if everybody is the same color or any race they want to be? Now, science fiction, one of the first science fiction books, not the first science fiction book, but one of the early science fiction books written by an African-American, George Schuyler, was called Black No More in 1931. And he speculated on this. The basic synopsis of Black No More is it's a satire. So it makes fun of the concept of race, because race, Schuyler didn't believe in race at all, So, and in this book, black people turn themselves white, but they're actually, when they turn themselves white, they actually turn out to be whiter than white people, the normal white people. So the white people, in order to differentiate themselves from the newly white black people, start to tan themselves, and they turn themselves black, darker, So the black people become white and the white people become black, and then the whole cycle continues. All right. So it was a satire about the ridiculousness of race in itself, but on a man who himself was somewhat of a weird eugenicist himself, in a sense, because he believed that black and white people combining together to produce offspring would produce a superior human being. And this is what he actually believed. And actually, he actually did it. His white wife was a Texan. I forgot her name, but they produced Philippa Schuyler, who was a prodigy. Philippa Schuyler was a prodigy. She was a prodigy. She was a pianist. She was a journalist and stuff like this. She had a tragic death, though. But Philippa Schuyler was everything that they said that they were going to try to produce, in terms of that. But that's just extra information for you. Not that goes nowhere. And then Danzy Senna in 1998 wrote this thing right before the 2000s called the Mulatto Millennium. Seems like a long time away now. It was strange, and in her world, everybody, people loved mulattoes. That mulattoes started to rule the world. Everybody wanted to be beige in that particular sense. So it's a strange to wake up and realize you're in style. That what's happened to me just the other morning. It was the first day of the new millennium, and I woke to find that mulattoes had taken over. Right? And there's a lot more to that particular story, but these are ideas that I'm trying to get to you about these transracial ideas and how they would affect possibly the black family of the future. But you don't have to go there. I'm just giving you some ideas, something to think about, Also, Regina was talking about the importance of religion. And even in that little strength theory that I talked about, there was in terms of like having a strong black family, religion was extremely important aspect of that strength theory. All right. But as Professor, let's see. Oh my, I forgot Professor's last name. Professor Cook. I'm sorry. Dr. Cook was talking about earlier. We had a conversation with her that there's been a decrease in people identifying with Christianity, a decrease in people being religious in general. And if that decrease, speculate about, then use your sci-fi hat. If that decrease keeps increasing, if it keeps decreasing and stuff like this, what will that be for the black family of the future? The future of religion and family, how will that affect it? If religion has a lower aspect to it, will marriage still be important in that particular sense? Oh, and that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. Right now, I want you to put on your sci-fi hats. I wanted to see if anybody has any questions and anything about what I've just set up for you, or anything that Professor Garcia has said that we can talk about in terms of the future of the black family.
Professor White, I thought I heard, I thought I read somebody said something in the chat.
Yes, ma'am.
Mhm.
We had a question from Professor T, who asks, is there a connection between Darwinism and extinction theory?
In terms of Hoffman, I would probably say there is. I think a lot of things were a connection in terms of trying to explain the superiority of a particular group. You know, the whole idea is that what doesn't, and some of that stuff is incorrectly, it's like pseudoscience. I'm not saying Darwinism is pseudoscience. I'm saying like the incorrect ideas that came from Darwinism, like extinction theory, were pseudoscience in that particular sense. So I would definitely say that it was definitely connected, because that was a very influential science in terms of like looking at the hierarchy of people and who succeeds and who doesn't succeed. And it was also a really good way to explain simple things like why Black people are on a lower class or a lower level than white people without looking at the social structure itself. It explains it naturally. So I would say yes.
I think there was also another question from Michael.
Right. There was a comment from Michael who said that I think we will be one race. And so I posed back to him to ask, did he think that this would be a new race? Or did he think that people would assume or meld into the current race? And his answer was that he thought that they would meld into one of the current races. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, look, I think everybody should answer that question.
Yeah.
We're looking 400. We're looking 400 years in the future. All right,
Right.
400 years is not a long time in terms of evolution. So I mean, and you can do a lot of mixing, but even that much mixing is not. I don't think that's going to change the entire face of society. Now, you're talking about psychologically, will everybody consider each other to be human, or spiritually, will everybody consider to be each other human? I hope so. You know. But that goes into the other question, whether or not spirituality or religion will be still an effective aspect of our society 400 years or more into the future in that particular sense.
You know, I think that's an interesting question, and Professor Miles and I have talked about this before. I actually still think that um, I actually think that the Black race will still, oh, well, I shouldn't say the Black race, but the concept of Blackness will still exist. And I still think the identification will still exist. I mean, we can look at people who have been through, or populations that have been through, they've been ravaged, and in regards to, many of their members were killed or driven, into other areas. And so even when you are able to do genetic testing, or people, they look to genetic testing to see what their DNA says about them, they find out that, sometimes what they identify with does not necessarily match the majority of what their DNA represents. And so, but there's still this cultural hold to that particular ethnicity. I think even despite the trials and tribulations of the past and even the current times, there will be people who will want to hold on to who they are. And I think at this point, I mean, really, we can, most of us say, most Black people in the United States, and pretty much in a lot of other places, are genetically, their DNA is diverse. And so, but we still kind of hold on to a particular identification. Um, I think, because we feel almost, and we were talking about this as well, almost an allegiance to it. We don't want it to die. We don't want to be forgotten. We don't want the culture to be forgotten. And I think, in much the same way as immigrants have, try to hold on to their traditions and even though they may, if they're coming here and they're coming from a Western Europe, and they look very much like people who have been here for for centuries, there are people that still hold on to who they are. culturally or ethnically. I think in 400 years, people will look back and still identify that way and say, look at where we came from, because that's a you know that's a thing.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of futurism does. I mean, there's Afrofuturism, which is what we're talking about today. But the
Right.
future, those ideas of like whether or not there's the cultural diversity exists within inside your particular group, whether or not your group will, like in terms of its language, or will still be in existence. Those things are held by other groups too. I mean, it changes a little bit. Like Asian futurism is different from indigenous futurism, but indigenous futurism has cares about a lot of the things that Afrofuturism cares about, especially when it comes to representation in the future. You know.
I think that common line of if you've experienced that, if your people, the people you identify with, have experienced that a certain kind of oppression, oppression is oppression, and so there's some common things that are going to come out of it, even though there may be some specific issues that each culture or ethnicity or whatever might have. I think there is some even in Asian futurism, even in Black futurism, and certainly Professor Miles is more versed on that than I am. I just love crack country. I mean, well, I love gods and okay, but anyway, I think that you know, I mean, yeah, I'm gonna stop it right there.
We have a few more questions, or a couple more questions. Professor, excuse me, Michael Stevenson asked, will race categories still be important 400 to 500 years from now?
I don't know. You tell me, man. I mean, that's the thing. That's why I want you guys to speculate on that. I mean, if they are still important, why? Why would they still be important? That's what I'm saying. I mean, in some ways, if you have, in some ways, like I think what Professor Garcia said it. It's not about the category; it's about the idea. The racial category is about the idea. Is Blackness only external features? I mean, is it only external features? That's what it is. Is Blackness only external? Are these what people assume to be essential characteristics, physical characteristics, the only thing that makes me Black and stuff like this? But if you start to consider things like that, then you might have to give some idea, thought to transracialism and stuff like that in the future. Now I'm not saying that this is something possible now, but in a transhumanist future, if you could change yourself to be anything, what does anything matter in terms of your outside? It all depends on what you believe and what your philosophy is, and what you choose to identify as. Then again, there's always some sort of social negotiation going on. I mean, right now, how do you know you're Black, like or white or Asian? How do you know it? And the reason why, because you have people that you negotiate your identity with. That might be your family. Your family has told you you're Black or you're whatever and stuff like this, and therefore you identify that way. You're Irish American, and they say, and you believe yourself to be Irish American. When you put your name, the government has some aspects to that too. They've sent out a census. They ask you what you are in terms of your ethnic or racial group. Other people outside of your group, friends and other families and stuff like this, might identify you as Irish American. And in that particular sense, then you are Irish American. Your identity is negotiated between that group. Of course, when somebody negotiates poorly, like Rachel Dolezal did,
Right.
then you're rejected from both groups, from both groups in a particular sense, So, is there going to be will that be still a thing? Will identity and negotiation still be a thing when anybody can be anything that they want? I don't know. Speculate.
It's interesting because I didn't reject Rachel Dolezal. I take the heat. I mean, I looked at her. I just kept looking at her, and I'm going, she looked like some of my cousins. I have, but I mean, like,
we are all cousins.
Identify as, right, I'm everybody's cousin, right? I have cousins that do identify as Black, and they are, like their ancestors are, but they're so very uh, mix that you can't, somebody, there could be some question, and from other people, but they've negotiated. We told them, yeah, you black, so that, um, that's it. That is interesting. And I think what makes it more interesting is that she adopted it, and then, I mean, when you identify that way, that means that that's a walk you have to walk. Now, I would have some smack to talk about if she walked the walk and when it got hot, she jumped out.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
see, to me, I mean, if we just to me, Rachel Dolezal did all the right things, in a sense. I mean, like, when I say that, I'm saying, like, again, she loved Black people. She loved the culture. She married a Black man. You didn't have to marry a Black man, but still, she married a Black man. She had Black children and stuff like this. But the biggest thing was that she didn't tell. It seems to be really offensive to people when you present yourself as something that you're not, or what they perceive you not to be, and they're insulted by that. I mean, across the board, and that seems like that's what happened. And also, the idea is that she didn't experience it. There are certain things that for example, the doll test. Everybody knows the doll test, right? Everybody out there knows the doll test. Like they have these African-American children. They're like anywhere from like 3 to 5 years old. They give them a white doll and a black doll, and they get the white doll and they say it's pretty, and they get the black doll, they say it's ugly, or something like that. Or they get the white doll and they say it's good, and get the black doll, they say it's bad. And these are African-American kids doing this now. And this is still a modern thing that happens. It doesn't happen as much as it used to, but it still happens enough, right? Even with this new mindset that we have, and our awareness of this in our own society, it still happens. And that's something that she never had to go through as a kid, because she was already born that way. So people get offended because she had never had to go through the experience, all those initial experiences of being Black and adopting those things, those maybe some of those invisible things that you acquire in Blackness, just being born and stuff like this, and just living in America as it is. And that offended people too, because she didn't earn her way, because she just, and then she could always change back if she wanted to, but I don't think she would have. The thing is, I don't think she would have.
Yeah, come too far. She come too far. We have more questions.
Yes, we do. Professor T asked, in regards to environmental justice, please comment on how climate change might play into the identities and freedoms of Indigenous, Black, and people of color.
Man, that's a big question.
You got it.
I got it. Go leave me with that one. Well, I mean, climate change. I mean, I guess it all has to do with. I'm not sure about climate change, but I do know about the land and land being important. And if you're going to look back at Native Americans where their land was either stolen or taken, or they were lied to, they signed treaties and the treaties were not, they didn't go by the treaties. They try to do a pipeline when they know they're not on ceded lands and things like that. So land is important for, I guess, especially for a group of people who have been marginalized or segregated for a long particular time from the gold standard of any society, sort of like as maintaining their importance as a group, right? And that whole idea of being connected to the land and the spirits of your forefathers being connected to that land, that's important, and they're important to everybody, and especially Native American, Indigenous people that live in America. Now, for us, for Black people, we got the whole 40 acres and a mule thing too, but we're also disconnected in a way. I only consider Black people to be disconnected if we believe that we're disconnected from Africa. All right. If you don't believe that, if you believe you still have a connection to Africa, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But the thing is that I've heard other Black people say, other Black professors say, in fact, what was the one, who said it? At UVA, what was it? was it wasn't Maya Angelou, but somebody was saying that, being aware of your African roots is important, but also be aware of your American roots, the things that your people went through in America to get you to the point where you were, because a lot of that African connection stuff was because Black people during the 20s, or even before, a little bit before the 20s, were looking for a way to identify themselves, because identifying yourself as Black during the Harlem Renaissance or something like that, the whole thing is that they were trying to create the new Negro. The new Negro was a new identity, a way of fitting into America and having self-esteem about self, right? And a lot of that had to do with either going back to Africa or being aware of Africa and using African ideas and concepts to build up that particular self-esteem, right? But a lot of people were saying like, well, we're not African anymore. We're African American, so to speak, but we're kind of like not a part of the African culture, so to speak. We're a part of American culture. We're Black people in America, and we have our own culture here that's been developed by us. So why not respect that and be more aware of that also? Not rejecting the other one, but also be aware of what your forefathers are going through in order to get to this point where you still exist, so to speak. I don't know. Getting back to the point of land, land is always important because land's important for money. It's important for identity. It's important for giving it to your family, so they can reap the benefits in the future and stuff like that. Passing on land has always been a good thing, which I've always been told by my great grandfather and stuff like that. So not having it makes you weak. Not having it or being connected to it, either spiritually or monetarily or physically, is a bad thing. I'm not sure if I answered about climate change, though. I don't know about that one, man. I'm sorry.
I think you did well.
All right.
Professor White.
Our next question comes from, and please forgive my pronunciation, Maria Valkin. Professor Garcia, do you think African Americans should reestablish Afro religions, since it is of common knowledge that Christianity was not African Americans' primary religion?
Okay, so I'm kind of glad you asked that. And I want you to go and watch the Black Church, because that is, I thought I had put the link in the chat, but the YouTube live, but I'm going to put that link in there because I didn't see it. So yeah, okay. So one thing that I think that it behooves us to recognize is that there's this belief that Africans did not have a knowledge of God as we perceive it, or perceive who God is, prior to coming to the United States, and that's not true. And so there are people who descend from Africans who were, in fact, Muslim. And I know that's not Christian, but that God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Ishmael. So that there's knowledge. If you have knowledge of your Islamic faith, you have knowledge that there is a Christian faith. So there is that knowledge. And so, and actually when you watch the Black Church, because I'm trusting and believing that you will, you'll see that seeps into the Christianity that many Africans practice today in small ways, sometimes undiscernible. Sometimes we do things we don't even know why we're doing them, and it comes from something that we brought over. And that is also true of the African religions. Those African religions actually, they don't have to be reestablished because they're still practiced. And so if you are aware of religions such as, Yoruba religion, Vodun, and different, the different religions representative of the different ethnic groups in Africa, then you'll see. I have many friends. I have many friends who their faith is or they practice Yoruba religion. And so what you'll find, I think, when you look at when I look at the ones who I know, what I often see is that there is a melding of traditions, you know. Um, and I like to say that I think also when we think about Christianity and the concept of God, um, really want y'all to watch the Black Church. And then I want you to look up a man named James Cone. Okay. So James Cone was the father of Black theology, and so you might say, well, "What? God is God," you know, but he kind of breaks that down. You know, he has a different viewpoint on that. So I wish my husband was up here because he is all in. He would be all in right here to talk about that. But yeah, I think yes, certainly. You can't if you are desirous, especially if you are desirous of being connected with your culture. And like I said, I indicated earlier that I have done my DNA and I've had my DNA done. I'm in many genealogy groups. Have relatives all around the world. Have connections with people that are my cousins and have been in their locations for so many generations that I know that some of my ancestors came from that space. And so when you talk about those spaces and that culture, you can't help but, you know, talk about religion. And I think if you keep yourself from paying attention to it, and this is just my thought, if you keep yourself from paying attention to it, you're kind of missing out. That you at least need to know. But that's me, you know. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. Miss White, what was the question again?
It is, do you think African Americans should reestablish Afro religions since it is a common knowledge that Christianity was not African Americans' primary religion?
Right.
I mean, that's
So
definitely an
I guess my
Afro-Christian idea.
response to that is I think African Americans made whatever they encountered their religion. And I think that was an adaptation for survival. So when you look like any place where you had Catholicism as the primary faith system or in that area, you will find some folks who poured that African religion right into that Catholicism, and and so you know it's you might hear their deities actually became saints and things like that. I do have there is someone here, I don't know if she would come off mute to talk about that a little bit. Dr. Rook, the lady, the professor, the dean, excuse me, dean of arts and sciences, Dr. Stephanie Rook. She is from Louisiana, and so but it's not just Louisiana. It's, you know, very many places where people have um, done what they had to do in order to keep themselves edified, to stay healthy. I have people in my family who are healers, and they have they practice some techniques and traditions that help get people through in times when they could not access traditional medicine and all of that. So yeah, I guess I would say if people are interested, they should pursue that. But I think that's up to the individual. I'm just saying that it's out there if they want to. There's no need to reestablish it.
Okay. Our next question, what this comes from Kenley Cook. What singular aspect of the slavery era? Okay, let me start all over. What singular aspect of the slavery era,
Error.
both of you feel will have the greatest impact on Afrofuturism?
Great. What was that? What of the slavery? How much of? Okay.
So what singular aspect of the slavery era do both of you feel will have the greatest impact on Afrofuturism?
Well, I guess we have to frame it in terms of the family, right? So that's the question. I mean, I like the frame it in terms of the family. Like, what happened in slavery will affect us into the future, or what will be 400 years going back to the original question, 400 years in the future, how will the Black family be? Now, there was during the 70s, they were talking about Africaneity of the Black family, that the Black family had already had some aspects of African the social systems, especially family social systems in it in order to survive during slavery times. That has, especially the extended family, ideas that is very common in African societies, especially West African societies and things like that. And that extended family sort of like still came over with us because we're all from the ones that did come over were from the West Africa and stuff like that. So we all had that concept. And that's why the adaptation of when you lost family members and when children were taken in by other family members and other people, other groups that became family and stuff like this, that's something that we could expand upon in the future, because in that sense, it's almost like a new negritude, I suppose, a spatial negritude, so to speak. In the future, 400 years from now, we're all still connected as one single family. So sort of like in order to survive and to thrive, as we did when we were slaves, because that's the reason why we had to do that. Because the separation of children, of people being sold down the river and stuff like this, but still having to lean on the community and become that extended family, that natural extended family, that was considered one of the strengths of the Black community by some people, and a weakness by people who saw it as a pathology, so to speak. So, but I think in terms of Afrofuturism, I think that could be extended into the future 400 years, sort of like a new negritude in that sense, combining all together into one large family, one uni-mind, Mo Blackness. Yes. Yeah, I can see that. But like I said, I like to think in terms of getting back to the point of thinking 400 years in the future. What does that mean? What could that mean? What could that look like? I can't hear you, Regina.
I'm just agreeing with you, and it kind of takes me back to a little bit to a conversation we were having yesterday about what do we do, with all of these children who end up being displaced from their homes for whatever reason, and really not having these good systems and setups in order to address the their raising and their ability to prosper and all of that. And so I would hope, Afro-futuristically, hope that we would be able to establish some things that would address those issues. It terrifies me to think of children being in harm's way, because of something that is outside of, especially because of something that's outside of their control. I always feel they should be protected, they should be loved, they should be given every opportunity to go beyond what they were maybe born into. And so I hope that is something that is addressed, because I think it's an issue.
Those are all the questions that we have at this time.
Okay.
That worked out because it's 4:58. And we're on time, and we would really like to thank, you can't see him, he's the poster dude, Mr. Ken Peel, for providing our technical support for today. He gets the claps from all of us. He's wonderful.
Showed up.
Much. That's my cousin, y'all. That's my cousin. Okay, I'm sorry.
There.
Anyway, and we thank you for being here. On today, we like to thank you, Professor Miles, this is his second time with PCC. We hope it won't be his last. We hope he's not going to be tired of us. And on
Never
behalf,
be tired of PCC. Never.
never be tired of PCC. That's it. That's it. And so on behalf of PCC Global and ECU Ethnic Studies and all of that, I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you to Professor Cherie White, English professor extraordinaire and a student advocate of the century, for being our facilitator, and our Dean, Dr. Dean of Arts and Sciences, Stephanie Manley Rook, for introducing us and watching over us. She's trying to make sure it goes down correctly, I know. So thank you for all of that. And we wish you, extend our blessings to you, and have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for coming. And this will be on YouTube. So if you want to go back and rewatch, you can do that too. All
Use
right.
your sci-fi thinking cap.
That's it.